Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's discuss seed oils. I was quite keen to do a deep dive on seed oils and inflammation, heart disease, processing chemical solvents, and hexane, heating, overheating, reheating, and their use in processed foods. So today we'll summarize what was over 75 hours of research amongst our research team and myself, distilling over 50 studies down into a few really important conclusions regarding seed oils, some of which are positions I've changed my mind on in light of the research that we've gone through. So just as a quick recap and a few points of nomenclature, seed oils are rich in omega-6, especially linoleic acid. And in many of the papers that we'll discuss, you'll hear this term linoleic acid come up. It's kind of a stand-in for seed oils, again, because seed oils are very rich in linoleic acid. And conversely, seed oils are low in saturated fat. Soybean, canola, safflower, sunflower, cottonseed, grapeseed, peanut, sesame, these are all seed oils. And olive oil and avocado oil are not seed oils. Regarding linoleic acid, it is considered an essential fatty acid that the body can't synthesize. It needs to obtain through diet. Deficiencies can lead to dry skin, hair loss, metabolic problems of various sorts, and it does function as an important component of the inner mitochondrial membrane. Now, all that being said, there might be a number of deleterious effects from seed oil. So let's examine some of these, starting with inflammation. There are two main claims that are made regarding seed oils being pro-inflammatory. The first involves arachidonic acid and the fact that linoleic acid, seed oils, is one biochemical conversion away from arachidonic acid. And why does that matter? Well, arachidonic acid sits atop of multiple inflammatory pathways in the body: COX, LOX, and CYP450. Now, if you've ever taken an Advil, you've blocked the COX enzyme. So I think we've all had some experience, whether it be joint pain or a headache, using a COX inhibitor. So it at least makes some intuitive sense that too much arachidonic acid, and therefore any of these COX, LOX, and CYP450 might be a problem, might lead to inflammation. The other pro-inflammatory claim is that seed oils are very prone to oxidation. Regarding oxidation, depending on how saturated the fat is, there are less double bonds or more double bonds. The more saturated, the less double bonds. The more unsaturated, like mono and polyunsaturated, the more double bonds. This matters because the double bonds are more easily oxidized, damaged by things like oxygen or heat. Thus, the seed oils, due to having the higher levels of unsaturation and double bonds, are more amenable to damage from cooking, therefore oxidation. And when the fats are oxidized, they create these unhealthy inflammatory byproducts. Picture a chicken breast that was just totally charred and black. It would be very intuitively obvious that you wouldn't want to eat that chicken due to the overcooking. That's kind of a loose analogy to what happens if we overheat and therefore oxidize fats. And so perhaps seed oils, due to the more unsaturation, are more unstable and therefore form more oxidative byproducts and lead to inflammation. This is why one review paper commented, and I'll quote, "Omega-6 polyunsaturated linoleic acid promotes oxidative stress, oxidized LDL, chronic low-grade inflammation, and atherosclerosis, and is likely a major dietary culprit for causing coronary heart disease, especially when consumed in the form of industrial seed oils." And by the way, if this has been helpful, please comment and subscribe. This really does help us reach more people who are trying to improve their health, so it is quite deeply appreciated. Okay, so thus far, it seems kind of straightforward that seed oils might be inflammatory. But what are, if any, counterpoints to these arguments? And this is an area where I've sort of shifted my opinion. You see, most scientists and most research used to think that omega-6s and linoleic acid were inherently inflammatory and caused oxidative stress. However, and somewhat surprising to me, there's a more recent and fairly robust data set demonstrating that omega-6 are not inherently inflammatory. So let's go back to that arachidonic acid. It turns out that conversion of dietary linoleic acid, so seed oils, into arachidonic acid is tightly regulated. In fact, less than 1% of dietary linoleic acid is actually converted into arachidonic acid. In fact, some studies have found it to be even less than that at 0.2%, quoting one review paper. Importantly, because the production of arachidonic acid from linoleic acid is tightly regulated, wide variations in dietary linoleic acid do not materially alter tissue arachidonic acid content. In tracer studies, the extent of conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid is 0.2%. And perhaps even more compelling, a systematic review that summarized 36 different studies looking at what happens when we modulate the dietary intake of linoleic acid. We'll have people try eating more, eating less, and then monitoring arachidonic acid. Quoting, decreasing dietary linoleic acid up to 90% was not significantly correlated with changes in arachidonic acid levels. When dietary linoleic acid levels were increased up to 6-fold, no significant correlation with arachidonic acid levels were observed. So it seems that even though these are connected, linoleic acid and arachidonic acid, via biochemical pathways, the conversion is fairly insignificant. But what about oxidation? A 2017 meta-analysis looking at 30 randomized control trials, so a pretty compelling data point, essentially found that seed oils do not increase inflammation. Quoting, our meta-analysis suggested that increasing dietary linoleic acid, so seed oils, does not have a significant effect on blood concentrations of inflammatory markers. And one important point of clarification from this paper, they did look specifically at seed oils at various intake levels, including sunflower, safflower, soybean, corn, sesame, canola, and even blends of various oils. So this study did look directly at and examine the results from consumption of seed oils. And then there was one study in particular that looked at a slightly different marker called lipid peroxidation, comparing a high consumption of canola oil versus a high consumption of saturated fat. And after 1 month, they found there was no increase in lipid peroxidation across groups. In fact, the canola oil group had lower total and LDL cholesterol. And I like the way Gil Cavallo comments on this, which is things don't function the same in a complex biological system as they do in a test tube, which is why it's really important that we look at some of these mechanisms, the biochemical pathway of linoleic acid, arachidonic acid, or oxidation, and then test that in humans who alter their dietary consumption. So conclusions thus far, mechanistically, linoleic acid seed oils appear inflammatory due to arachidonic acid and oxidation. However, linoleic acid does not have a significant impact on arachidonic acid, oxidation, lipid peroxidation, or inflammatory markers. What about heart disease? It is possible that there are other mechanisms through which increasing consumption of seed oils, linoleic acid, will foster heart disease. It's often cited that heart disease levels started to rise in the population upon introduction of seed oils into the US food supply. And this is partially true, and that's what you're seeing in this graphic, but it leaves out a really important point. In 1911, the introduction of seed oils was via Crisco, a high trans fat. So it's not really fair to say that linoleic acid equals heart disease because it was most likely the trans fat via the Crisco. The more important thing, or the more interesting thing in my opinion, if we draw out this trend line further in time, we see linoleic acid consumption increases, yet coronary heart disease death rates decline. So it's probably not quite as simple as correlating these two, especially when factoring in tobacco use in the early 1900s, in 1910, 11 was quite popular, and obviously it's fallen out of vogue. So there's multiple things that may skew this really general population snapshot. We do have data looking at observation. Observation's not perfect, but it's going to be one step further down the hierarchy or up the hierarchy of scientific evidence. So some of the observational data here show that higher linoleic acid correlates with a decreased risk of coronary heart disease, of type 2 diabetes, of all-cause mortality, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. And importantly, these studies did control for confounding variables like smoking, age, sex, weight, and so on. That being said, observational data, it's not the cleanest data because it can still be confounded. So we can go one step higher in the hierarchy of evidence, and we can look at randomized control trials, or even better yet, meta-analyses summarizing the totality of randomized control trials. When we look at this data, again, we see the same thing, that consumption of linoleic acid in place of some dietary saturated fat, not all, decreases total and LDL cholesterol, as well as lowers triglycerides and ApoB. And to be clear and careful, I am not saying that saturated fat is bad, but it might be overconsumption that is problematic. And there was a couple of studies that tried to answer this question, looking at overfeeding of saturated fat versus seed oils. And they found that overfeeding of saturated fat led to higher cholesterol and higher liver fat, and this was not seen with the seed oils. This was using a palm oil versus a sunflower oil. And maybe you don't like the palm oil, but nevertheless, the two studies that tried to quantify this, again, couldn't really find any negative effects from overfeeding of seed oils. In fact, if anything, there's some negative consequences of overconsumption of saturated fat. Again, not saying that sat fat is bad. Now, to play devil's advocate for a moment, you may be saying, but I heard a certain thought leader make a pretty compelling case that seed oils are unhealthy. This tends to come from one of a few places. Firstly, like we just covered, citing mechanistic or biochemical data, arachidonic acid, oxidation, which is pretty interesting, but doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Then there are two randomized control trials that did find negative effects of consumption of seed oils. These are the Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Survey. That being said, we should always look at the totality of data because no one or two studies are perfect. And that's the case with Sydney and with Minnesota. Now, Sydney, this study did find a 62% higher incidence of total mortality when consuming more seed oils, as well as a 70% higher incidence of coronary heart disease mortality and a 74% higher incidence of cardiovascular disease mortality. But there's a really key flaw in the Sydney Diet Heart study, which is the oil administered was soft margarine as safflower oil, meaning it was a trans fat. It was very similar to Crisco. So, again, trans fat is sort of creeping its way into the picture here and murkying the read. What about the Minnesota Coronary Survey? This study found that there was no reduction in heart disease or death rate when people consumed more seed oils in the place of saturated fat. And they even found there was more deaths amongst the older subjects who consumed more of the seed oil, in this case, corn oil. But there were a few flaws in this study also. 83% of the subjects did not complete the study, and the study therefore became underpowered to substantiate the conclusions. And also, it wasn't clearly disclosed if a trans fat was used or not. So we can't really draw any firm conclusions from these studies. And thankfully, we do have other studies, meta-analyses that summarize the overall body of randomized control trials. And that brings us to two, I think, very important data points as it pertains to seed oils, linoleic acid, and heart disease. The first is a meta-analysis by Hamley from 2017. Now, this meta-analysis, as you see here, did include Sydney and Minnesota, as well as 3 other studies. And they found that seed oils were neutral. They weren't harmful, they weren't helpful. Conversely, a follow-up study 3 years later by Cochrane, the prestigious Cochrane, looked at 7 of the highest quality randomized control trials, and they actually found a slight benefit when replacing some dietary saturated fatty acid with seed oils. In fact, they found that swapping of some sat fat for linoleic acid seed oils led to a 21% reduction in cardiovascular events. So the best data point we have, I think, is pretty compelling regarding seed oils being neutral to beneficial. But let's criticize these 2 meta-analyses. Were there any flaws? Maybe the studies were too short. The studies included ranged from 2 years to 8 years. So I think that's an ample follow-up interval. What about funding? The majority of these studies, all but one actually, were funded by academic or government institutions and not by industry. So even when we criticize and are a bit scrupulous, I don't think we can toss out the validity of these findings. Regarding heart disease, the conclusion I come away with is there's a fair degree of incorrect citation of mechanism, that's the arachidonic acid, the oxidation, or cherry picking of Sydney and Minnesota. But the best data that we have find that when replacing some dietary saturated fatty acid for linoleic acid seed oils will lead to neutrality or benefit as it pertains to heart disease. So one other point I wanted to make was regarding the relationship to omega-3 and omega-6. The more antiquated thinking, and what I used to believe, was if you ate omega-6, it sort of crowded out omega-3, and it was the balance of the two that was really important, and therefore eating less omega-6 was the goal. And that's kind of what we debunked, if you will, with that study that had people alter, either increase or decrease their omega-6 intake, and found even when drastically reducing their omega-6 intake, there was no change in inflammation. But parallel and separate to that is omega-3. And what appears to be the case is that you need to have an absolute level of omega-3 intake in order to reap the anti-inflammatory benefits and the cognitive benefits from omega-3s. And also importantly, the current recommendations by the AHA of 2 servings of fatty fish per week are likely not sufficient to hit this required minimal intake of omega-3. And more contemporary guidelines suggest the following. You need 3 servings of fatty fish per week, plus for 3 months or a little over, you should supplement with 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of either fish oil or algae oil in order to hit this requisite minimum of omega-3 intake. And here are a few examples of fish: mackerel, salmon, herring, tuna, sardines, and shrimp, all high in omega-3. The only one that's high in mercury would be the tuna. So there's lots of options from a dietary perspective. So let's now discuss processing, chemical solvents, and hexane. There's a really important, I think, definition that we should clarify here, which is refining or processing is very different than hydrogenation. Any changing of a food classifies it as being processed, but there's different levels of processing. So to refine an oil is actually not deleterious, and we'll go over the data here in a moment. When you process the oil to the extent to where you hydrogenate it, that's a problem. So the clear distinction is refinement, okay, hydrogenation is very bad. Now, when we refine, this typically means we're using some sort of chemical solvent, hexane, to help extract the oil from the seed. Now that may sound bad, but actually one of the benefits from using this chemical extraction process is it increases the smoke point, meaning it's safer to cook with the oils. And we'll come to a chart in a moment that has swayed me to start using refined oils, seed or things like coconut oil, when cooking, because I've probably been exceeding the smoke point of these oils and therefore leading to some of these negative byproducts that occur when you overheat. The potential downside of the processing is you have less nutrients, but it's actually the nutrients in the oil that make it more sensitive to heating. This doesn't really apply if you're not going to be cooking, but if you're like, I'm assuming many of us, you're going to bake, you're going to saute, and you're very likely going to be going over the 300 to 350 degrees that most of these oils that are unrefined, the virgin oils, so to speak, the cold press oils, have as their limit of heat tolerance. Not all processing is the same. Refinement seems to be okay, but when you're in a processed food and you see on the label hydrogenated whatever it is, that's trans fat and you want to avoid that. Let's look into a little more directly the solvent used in the processing or the refinement known as hexane. Now, hexane in high levels is harmful, and some residue can remain even after filtration. It turns out when you look into this that even in refined oils, there's only a very low level of hexane, far below what is deemed harmful. Case in point here, a 2019 review of 40 studies found that when looking at canola, corn, and sunflower oil, yes, some seed oils had hexane, but even the highest amount was 23 times lower than what is deemed harmful, not by US regulators, but by the European Union, which seems to be a little bit more scrupulous with their standards. And maybe you don't trust any of these regulatory bodies. That's fine. There was even 2 studies that compared refined oils versus cold pressed oils regarding the impact they had on people consuming them and inflammatory markers. And they found no difference. Also, coming back to the Hamley and the Cochrane meta-analyses on heart disease, I believe most of these studies used refined oils. It's not clearly listed, but knowing that the refined oils are going to be cheaper, it's likely that in these studies, the researchers, for compliance and for affordability, used the refined oils. So there's multiple data points, some inferential, that the refined oils don't seem to be a problem. Very different than ultra-processed foods that contain hydrogenated oils, and we'll come back to that in more detail in a second. But there's one other point I wanted to make, which was you'll hear this argument that seed oils were a byproduct initially of the cotton industry. They were discarded and now they're being recycled and used, which I don't think is a very savory observation, but just because a foodstuff used to be discarded doesn't mean it's a harmful food. Whey protein used to be dumped into sewers and waterways, and now people pay top dollar for a high quality whey protein due to the fact that whey protein can improve body composition, immune function, and even through its high cysteine content may help to increase levels of the antioxidant glutathione. And one more example, many cultures got into a habit of discarding things like organ meats from animals. So just to say that, they were discarded, we could maybe argue via that same logic that now companies that are making sort of these ancestral blend meats that include organs are just trying to fill the meats with cheap waste products. I don't agree with that argument, but it's sort of using the same logic that if something at one point was discarded, it's automatically bad. So in conclusion on chemical processing, hexane, the solvent that makes the refined oils, does not appear to be a problem. Cold pressing can completely avoid this. There are trade-offs, and we're going to come to this in one second, but remember the refining increases the heat stability and therefore makes it safer to cook with. The key point would be the processing or the hydrogenation is what leads to trans fat, and that should definitely be avoided. Okay, so now let's come to heating and reheating, and this is where the refinement and the smoke points or the heat stability comes into play. What you're seeing in this graphic is for different oils, you see very clearly the ones that are refined have the highest heat stability, meaning they're safer to use at higher heat cooking, and the ones that are virgin or unrefined have the lowest level of heat stability. This really matters when you're going to be cooking, right? One of the things that I'm changing in light of this is I used to get the virgin, the cold pressed coconut oil, and now I'm actually going to be getting the refined coconut oil because with the baking and the sauteing that I do, I almost for certain have been exceeding this 300 to 350 degree threshold. Now, here's what is also interesting. When you look at the price of refined versus virgin coconut oil, it's more than double the cost for the unrefined or the virgin. I do think it's important to sort of disentangle the fact that just because something is refined doesn't mean it's bad. And especially if you're going to be cooking, then this is where using a refined version of the oil will, yes, reduce some nutrients, but that comes at the trade-off benefit of making it more heat stable and therefore less likely to form some of these negative byproducts which occur when you overheat, thinking again of that analogy of the charred chicken breast, which we want to avoid. Now, similar to this is reheating. It's pretty clear that any reheating is bad with any oil. And this is what, and a huge credit and thank you to our research team for pulling together multiple studies into this, I hope, simple summative chart where you see different types of oil. So from left to right, you have in one grouping, ghee, lard, and coconut oil. In the middle, olive oil, and on the right side, seed oils. And what you're seeing going from left to right, the yellow, the orange, and the red show you the amount of trans fat that forms upon cycles of reheating. And what you see for all oils is the more you reheat, the more trans fat forms. Now, yes, there is slightly more formation of trans fat when reheating seed oils, but the difference between these groups is nominal. Here's another perspective to put this into context. In this graph, what you're seeing on the bottom are over cycles of reheating, the formation of trans fat. So you look at clarified butter, rapeseed oil, olive oil, soybean oil. But at the very top there, that orange line, that is the amount of trans fat in a hydrogenated fat. So even though any oil will experience formation of trans fat when you go through cycles of reheating, the amount of trans fat in a hydrogenated fat is significantly higher. You're looking at 1 unit per serving, let's say for simplicity, as compared to about 15. So it's about 15 times more trans fat in a hydrogenated fat than any level of reheating. So just all of that to put into context, the real enemy here is the hydrogenated fats. We don't want to be reheating any fat. All fats, whether they are seed oils or not, will form some trans fat upon reheating, but that is infinitesimally smaller than what occurs in a hydrogenated fat, which is why it is so crucially important to avoid the hydrogenated fats. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the hydrogenated or the trans fats. As you may know, 2015 FDA bans adding artificial or trans fats to the food supply. And prior to this, the main source of trans fat were hydrogenated vegetable oils. Now, vegetable doesn't mean seed, but many of the vegetable oils were seed oils. So this is where I think some of the backdrop of the seed oil criticisms rightfully come from. Here's the pernicious thing. At current day, it's still legal for food manufacturers to put 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving in food. How much is 0.5 grams? Well, most oils will have a small amount of naturally occurring trans fat. Using a teaspoon of coconut oil as the example, 1 teaspoon of coconut oil contains 0.01 grams of naturally occurring trans fat. So there's 50 times the trans fat in the allowable 0.5 grams per serving of a processed food. This is where I think the real problem comes from. That being said, there are many problems with ultra-processed foods. The high calorie and low nutrients. This is the sort of overfed, undernourished, and the trans fats. These are the problem, right? The hydrogenated fats. Secondary to this, emulsifiers, which have been shown to lead to higher levels of Crohn's disease, to trigger IBS, and to have a negative impact on the healthy commensal bacteria, and also some of the coloring agents. What you should look for is on the label, does it list hydrogenated fat, which, to me was a little bit mind-blowing that this is still allowed in our food supply. And I'll share with you 2 examples. One of a nut butter that contains hydrogenated seed oil, and the other that contains just a refined canola. The difference here is huge, right? And this is, I think, the clear distinction. So the anti-seed oil advocates have a correct point that I agree with. You want to avoid hydrogenated fats. But when we say processed, that doesn't distinguish between refined, which is okay, versus hydrogenated, which is not okay. So just bear that or those points in mind. In conclusion, seed oils do not seem to be inflammatory via arachidonic acid or via oxidation. They do not appear to cause heart disease. The refinement, the processing as far as it goes to refined, is not a problem, nor are the hexanes. However, if the processing includes hydrogenation, that is problematic. Heating, overheating, and reheating can be a problem if you exceed the smoke point for heating, and any reheating is problematic. So avoid fried foods of any type. And the one thing I'd want to tie in here is I don't think one has to be overly critical of the oils used at a restaurant, let's say, if they use seed oils, because any fried food is going to be presumably reheating oils and therefore leading to the formation of the trans fat. The real issue here is the processed foods specifically that contain the hydrogenated fats. So check your labels and avoid the hydrogenated oils of any stripe, whether it be vegetable or seed. Hopefully that helps to tie together a few of the points that I think are not always accurately discussed. In real simple bottom line conclusion, I think most of the claims made against seed oils are incorrect, probably coming from a well-intentioned place, because they're conflating the hydrogenated oils with refined oils, all under the term processed. So again, hopefully this helps you have a better understanding, and if nothing else, appreciate that you can include some seed oils, refined but not hydrogenated, in your diet if you like. Let me know what you think in the comments below.